So, today we are entering into 2 Samuel chapter 22, which is the third to last chapter of the entire story of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And as a result, we feel the book reaching its end, right? And really these last 4 chapters, the one we covered last week, and then this week's chapter, and the next 2 weeks' chapters, well, I guess 3 weeks because we're not going to be meeting next week. But these last 4 chapters of 2 Samuel really are just this nice little like bookend to the entire story. They're like the bow at the top of the gift wrapping, to where it really is just bringing all things together and just closing all the different narrative arcs. And that just kind of is my longer, complicated way of saying what I said when we first started 1 Samuel, which is that it's my conviction that 1st and 2nd Samuel are probably the height of like biblical literature in general. Even if the Bible is not the inspired word of God, I think that 1st and 2nd Samuel are just like brilliant when it comes to like just literary storytelling and like structure and what it's communicating. It's also just a really exciting story, and it packs a whole lot into very little. And I know that we've spent like over a year going through these books, but really, you could dedicate your whole life to just studying these books right here, not to mention the other 64 books found in the Bible. But, yeah, so we're just reaching the end of it, and that being said, a lot of the context that we have to cover, it's a little bit different than what we've covered in the past, because really up through chapter 20, anytime we arrived at a story, we kind of had to cover like a lot of in-depth specific details about the nature of like David's life and what had been going on, especially like those back chapters whenever you were dealing with like all this stuff that had directly flowed from like David's sin with Bathsheba and then the resultant like falling apart of his family. There was a whole lot of like important context you needed to know about like what happened in the preceding chapters. The context in these final things are a little bit different because you don't really need to know the specific events that happened in David's life. You more just need to know the major themes that have been running throughout the entire book, right? And so back in chapter 21, which we covered last week, we kind of saw 2 little vignettes, right? And really that's kind of how these 4 chapters are structured. There's basically just like, I compared it to The Return of the King last week. For any of y'all who've seen like The Return of the King like movie, Lord of the Rings, I talked about how when the movie seems like it's constantly getting ready to end, because there's so many different story elements that are being wrapped up, and so there will be one scene, and you're like, oh, the credits are about to roll. And then it cuts to like another scene, and you're like, oh, I forgot about that story element. Okay, now the credits are about to roll. And then it cuts to another thing, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm glad they addressed that too. Now the credits are about to roll. And basically there's like 7 different endings. Same thing with 2 Samuel. And so last week we saw 2 of those endings. This week we're going to see one of them. Next week, in 2 weeks, whenever we cover chapter 23, we're going to see another 2 endings, and then in the final chapter, we're going to see one other major ending. And it's really just all bringing the entire story of 1st and 2nd Samuel to a close. So maybe what's worth addressing is what did we cover last week? There were 2 main stories that we addressed, and we kind of talked about how they brought certain story elements to a nice fitting end. What was the first thing we covered in chapter 21?
There was a famine in the days of David for 3 years.
Why though? Like we don't need like a play-by-play of the entire chapter, but just what was the whole story about?
Because of Saul.
Yeah, Saul had done something to these people called the Gibeonites, and we talked about a lot of the context involving them. And David basically rectified the situation, right? Saul had made a major boo-boo, he did something bad, and David fixed that. Right, and he did something good to help solve the problem and bring about justice. What was that bringing to an end? Like, what was the story that whole thing was kind of bringing to an end?
Saul put the Gibeonites?
The end of
Gibeonites.
Saul's family.
Wait, so it's kind of, y'all are on the right track. What narrative element that's kind of been flowing through the whole books of 1st and 2nd Samuel did this bring to an end?
The house of David and the house of Saul.
Yeah, it was like the war between the house of David and the house of Saul. And we're actually going to see that again right here. And this whole chapter is going to be a song of deliverance that David sings after God gave him victory over his enemies. Right?
Amanda?
Hello. But yeah, so the first thing we saw was David's vengeance on the for the Gibeonites, and just basically fixing that whole problem. And that was kind of first off bringing an end to the the overarching storyline of like this combat between David and Saul. Also, could you go close that door for me, Sean? But even to a greater degree, I think what the cool thing about that story is and how it ends is that it doesn't end with David just totally wiping out Saul's family. Instead, the way that David brings an end to this ongoing feud is actually just by righting Saul's wrongs and bringing peace, right? And so we just get to see how David's a really good and amazing king, and how he ended this was not by just annihilating all those people. No. Instead, he just rectified the situation, he brought about justice, but then he also showed grace and mercy to Saul's family, and he took care of those that remained and stuff. And so that was the first part. And then we got to the back half of last week's chapter, and that was like our second little vignette or closing montage and closing story. And what was that covering, and what did it kind of bring to an end? Testing our memories.
How in the beginning, David was the only one that fought the giants, but at the end, everyone started else fighting the giants and defeating them.
Yeah, so that's one part, but what do we see at the very beginning of that section? Like, what basically gave rise to the need for all these other people to be fighting giants?
David's
slowing down.
warrior.
Yeah, David was getting older, he was getting slower, and so we actually kind of got to see David's retirement, which is another kind of fitting end, right? I mean, we saw how David began, and we got to see him walk into the valley to face this giant, and that was like the beginning of David's story. And so if we're ending 2 Samuel, you kind of want to see the end of David's story. And what we're going to see is that 2 Samuel doesn't close off David's story with death. Instead, it's just going to give us little snippets as he reaches the end of his life that is like a highlight reel, right? And so we saw the beginning of David as a warrior, and so we see the end of David as a warrior. And he doesn't die in battle being killed by a giant. Instead, he's about to be killed by a giant, but then one of his own men steps in and saves the day. And basically, the closing idea that we get to David being a warrior is the idea that he has equipped the people of Israel to be a nation of warriors, right? And so he was a good king who was not only a good soldier himself, but he produced good soldiers. And what he left behind was greater than what he was given whenever he showed up, right? And so that kind of brought warrior David's story to an end. And it also just served to kind of highlight what David was like as a king. And that leads us to chapter 22, where we are going to get our third little epilogue here. And this whole thing is going to be a psalm. It's just one song, and it is almost identical to Psalm 18. If you were to go to the book of Psalms and read Psalm 18, it is almost word for word the same thing. There are slight differences here and there, but it's Psalm 18. Right? And this is going to be a song of deliverance that David sings. And even before we go into the song, which is like 51 verses, so it's actually a pretty long chapter, but I think we'll be able to get through it, just because there's not like a narrative flow to it, so we can just cover the main points. But just by nature of it being a song, what does this immediately call to mind to you? It calls to mind the Psalms, but we've been studying 1 and 2 Samuel for a while. What does this bring to mind?
All those songs David sang in his reign, kind of.
Okay, well, yeah, so he was a psalmist who wrote a lot of psalms, but I'm specifically trying to get us to think in context of 1 and 2 Samuel. That's what we've been studying for the last year, right? What does this bring to mind? If the book is ending with a song...
Probably started with this one.
Did it?
No.
I'm not saying you're wrong.
It began with like Hannah singing?
Yes.
Hannah's song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there happened to be a song at the very beginning of 1 Samuel, right? And there was also one that kind of bridged 1 and 2 Samuel as well. But do you think it's accidental that the author, whenever he's composing this book, chooses to record a song at the beginning and a song at the end?
No.
Probably not. And so maybe in order for us to understand David's song, it's worth going back and rereading Hannah's song so that we can compare the two and see if maybe that is what the author is bringing to a close, right? it's probably worth a shot, right? And I think that our answer is going to be 100% that is what is happening here, right? This is just something I like for us to do because I don't want us to just, y'all probably picked up on this when it comes to me. My conviction regarding the Bible is that like a lot of people are very good at like understanding like one small story. You know, like they can like flip to the Bible and they're like, okay, I understand the story of David and Goliath. Cool. But they don't understand how that story contributes to like the book as a whole. And they almost treat the entire Bible like, the Bible is 66 books, but we almost treat it like it's a million really tiny books. You know, but like no, like 1st and 2nd Samuel was originally one book that a person sat down and wrote, and there's a beginning and an end to it. And so I don't want us to just know 1 Samuel 17, and I don't want us to just know David and Goliath. I want us to know how does that story contribute to the whole book, right? Because to me, that actually gives you a greater understanding of the story. And so that's why I want to highlight this, because you could just go through 2 Samuel chapter 22, and you could be like, here are the main points that David is making. Okay, that's cool. But guess what? You can go to Psalm 18 and arrive at the same exact understanding, because the psalm is also found in Psalm 18. But for some reason, the author decided to quote it here. And I think by comparing and contrasting, we'll see what the overall purpose is. So, 1 Samuel actually, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, this is what we read. And once again, the context of 1 Samuel chapter 2 is that there's this woman named Hannah who showed up before a priest, and she was praying because she wanted a baby. And she was barren. And her husband had another wife who was just popping out babies, but Hannah couldn't give birth. And so she was praying for a baby and praying for a baby and praying for a baby. And ultimately, God answers her prayer and gives her a baby, and she names that baby Samuel. That's who the book is named after, right? 1st and 2nd Samuel is named after Samuel. And as a result of this baby's birth, this is what Hannah has to say. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh." I want you to just keep track of the imagery, right? My heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I am glad in your salvation. There is no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Do not multiply speaking so very proudly. Let arrogance not come out of your mouth, for Yahweh is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but those who stumble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. Yahweh puts to death and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Yahweh makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He exalts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of glory. For the pillars of the earth are Yahweh's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his holy ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. For not by power shall a man prevail. Those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. And I'll remind you that the word for anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. Right? He will exalt the horn of his Messiah. Then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the young boy ministered to Yahweh before Eli the priest. Right? So there's Hannah's song. What is she ultimately communicating?
Her thankfulness to Yahweh for her child Samuel.
Kind of.
Sort of.
So that's the context of her singing the song. But if you remember, I mean, once again, this was like a year ago that we covered this. But you might remember that whenever we actually covered this chapter, we were kind of shocked by the content of what Hannah was singing, because it almost doesn't seem to directly relate to Samuel at all, right? It's almost like this woman is prophesying something that is entirely unrelated. She's talking about God exalting his king and God exalting his Messiah at a time whenever there wasn't even a king in Israel. And there was no promise of a Mashiach to come. And so we were kind of wrestling through that before, where we're like, okay, like, and whenever we studied it, we were able to find some connections there. So I think that, yes, she is thanking God for her child, but more broadly, what is she talking about? I will say it is prophetic, but what is she ultimately communicating in that song?
God will take nothing and make it something.
God will take nothing and make it something. Yeah, right? And you can see how she would arrive at that conclusion from the birth of her child, right? She was barren and she produces a child, and she takes that information and is like, well, if God can do this with me, what else can he do for the people of Israel? He will take the king and establish him. And so that's where she's ultimately heading with that. What else does she communicate in the song?
I think praise to God.
Yes.
He will protect the holy people.
Yeah. He'll protect the holy people, right? That's a big theme. Throughout the whole thing, she is saying, those who are faithful to Yahweh will be delivered. Those who are faithful to Yahweh will experience salvation. Those who rebel against God, they're going to eat dust and they're going to be destroyed. But those who are faithful to God, through them, this king will show up, and God's going to establish the king, and God won't allow this anointed one to meet destruction. And God's going to show up, and the imagery she uses is of, let's see. Yahweh puts to death and makes alive, right? He has the power to both kill somebody and bring life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up, right? So he can send you to the abyss, to the place of death, or he can raise you up from death. Yahweh makes poor and rich. He brings low and exalts. The idea is that God is in charge of all circumstances in life, right? He can lower you. He can raise you up. He can humble you. He can exalt you. He can kill you. He can give you life. He can destroy you, or he can make your day, right? He can do all of that. And so the lingering question is, how will you respond, right? And throughout it she says, there is no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there is no one besides you. So a lot of her song is focused on reflecting on the set-apartedness of God, how different he is, and how in charge of all situations he is, and ultimately how this should shape your worldview, because if you respond properly to him, especially in the context of the people of Israel, if you're responding well to him, things are going to go in your favor, right? Obviously, if you're not careful with this, you can head in the prosperity gospel direction and say, as long as you believe in God, life's going to be great all the time. That's not what she's saying. She's saying for those who are faithful to God, in the context of the people of Israel, he will make things work out for you, because that is a promise that he made. Rocky, were you going to say something?
Yeah, on the last line, it says he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. It's like she's like predicting David. You think of it.
Well, yeah, exactly, right? So she's talking about, once again, she's talking about a king, but there is no king at this time. She's talking about this in the time period of the Judges, which is very, very strange. But whenever you know the context of where the story's heading, all of a sudden you can see that even in chapter 2, groundwork is being laid for stuff to come. And you can see why the narrator would feel the need to quote this song right here. Just other imagery that she uses, just at the very end. Those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. So those who oppose him, they're going to be destroyed. They're going to be disappointed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The imagery of God riding on the clouds, sending lightning and thunder to scatter their enemies. Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king. He will exalt the horn of his anointed. Right? So God has a king. Even though there's no king in Israel at this time, God already has his king picked out, and he will exalt him. And if that king is faithful, he will he will experience God's salvation. Right? That is what Hannah is communicating. And we even talked about it back when we went through this. Mary's song in Luke chapter 2 is very, very similar to this. We call it the Magnificat. But the song that she sings, it's Luke chapter 1. Right? I think it's Luke chapter 1. But whenever she encounters John the Baptist, like whenever she goes to meet with Elizabeth and stuff, she sings this song. And the song is clearly calling back to Hannah's song, because it's ultimately the fulfillment of it. Right? But that's the context of this right here. And if you understand Hannah's song, you'll understand why the narrator who wrote this book felt the need to include David's song here. All right, so just hold on to that imagery, and it might even be helpful to have 1 Samuel chapter 2 opened up as we go through this one. Sound good? All right, so let's see what David has to say. Sean, take it away. I was about to start reading. I was like, wait, I'm not the reader here.
That's all good. And David spoke to Yahweh the words of this song in the day that Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. I call upon Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. For the ways of the death encompassed me, the torrents of vileness terrorized me, the cords of Sheol surrounded me, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon Yahweh, and I called to my God, and out of his temple he heard my voice, and my cry for help came into his ears.
Perfect. Thank you. So right off the bat, do y'all see some of the similar imagery popping up? What do we see?
Horn.
What else?
Calling out in distress.
Calling out in distress.
Did she mention the rock?
She did mention the rock.
Yeah, the rock.
Yeah, so very similar imagery right off the bat.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is once again where I'm just highlighting the beauty of 1st and 2nd Samuel just as a literary work. Even beyond it being the inspired word of God. It's just beautiful how it's bookended. Basically, what I'm going to suggest is that in 1 Samuel chapter 2, Hannah is praying a song that anticipates fulfillment. David is looking back on his life, and he is saying that he has experienced the very hope that Hannah prayed for. Right? And that's basically what we see in this song. But let's start off with the first verse, because this is going to give us context here, which kind of once again highlights the fact that maybe we're not dealing with stuff in a strictly chronological, from a strictly chronological perspective, because we talked about how last week we were dealing with David as an older man who couldn't even fight battles anymore because he was getting so old. But look at the context here. And David spoke to Yahweh the words of this song in the day that Yahweh delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So what seems to be the context of the song that he wrote here?
Like when he became king?
Yeah, it seems like it might be more when he became king, not at the end of his reign. Because, I mean, at the end of his reign, Saul's been dead for 40 years. And so it'd be kind of weird for him to say that he was just now delivered from the hand of Saul, unless you're wanting to imply that the whole Gibeonite thing was still Saul attacking him, metaphorically. But I think that's actually harder to suggest. I think that this is suggesting that the context of when he wrote this was at the beginning of his reign. Right? But the narrator saved that for this point. Because you remember, the narrator already included a different song that David sung after Saul's death. And that wasn't a time for David to exalt. Because instead, whenever Saul died, it was him mourning Saul's death and stuff like that. But instead, I think that the narrator chose to save it here because it bookends the whole book. And it highlights the themes that we were supposed to see carrying us throughout the whole story. And so, yeah, I would suggest this is probably written when David is still pretty young. Right? Do you remember how old he was whenever Saul died and whenever he became king?
30?
30. Yeah. He was 30 years old, and he'd been on the run for a while.
10 years?
Right? Yeah, probably about 10 years or something like that. He'd been on the run. And then finally, he becomes king, and it seems like this is the context of that. Which is actually really cool whenever you... Like, if you have the idea that this was written around the same time that he wrote the other song, it shows how you can have two vastly different responses to the same scenario. Because on the one hand, David is totally heartbroken over Saul's death. Because, you know, like, he loved Saul. And even though Saul was his enemy, he still cared for Saul. And he never held anything against Saul. And so he was eaten up by it and he grieved. But at the same time, he couldn't help but rejoice in what God had done for him. And the main reason I highlight that is because I think that realizing that also sheds further light on the whole Absalom situation that we read about just a few chapters ago. Remember whenever David heard that Absalom had died, and he was so broken over the grief of Absalom's death that he wasn't able to like put himself together and respond as a king probably should. I think that here we see that David is capable of doing both, and maybe that's what Joab knew, right? Joab knew, hey, when you were younger, you were able to do both. Whereas David in his older age, he had a tougher time making that distinction, right? And he was so focused on his grief that he wasn't also able to rejoice in what God had done on his behalf, right? And I think it's all just true to the human experience, where something horrible can happen, and you're like, okay, I wish things hadn't gone this way, but at the same time, I can see how God's working through this. And so I'm going to grieve what has physically happened, but at the same time, I'm going to worship God and praise Him for what He's accomplished. And so really, if you take this psalm right here and contrast it with the psalm at the beginning of 2 Samuel, you even get a cooler, like a really beautiful portrait of like this single moment whenever David has been delivered from Saul, and he's dealing with the grief, but he also can't help but praise God. All right, that being said, let's walk through the psalm, because it's a long one. Yahweh is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. All right, so right off the bat, what do we have David claiming? What is he asserting? What are some things we can take out of it?
God is David's fortress and deliverer.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Deliverer means like he protects him.
Yeah.
And fortress is like a place to rest on.
Yeah, so if you're just walking through it, the imagery at the very beginning is kind of confusing, right? Yahweh is my rock. Well, what do you mean rock? What? He's like it's just a rock? Well, no, like he explains what he means by that. He's my fortress. What is the imagery of a fortress? Like whenever you hear the word fortress, what do you think of?
Castle.
Yeah, or like a castle, right? Okay, so if he's saying God is my castle, what is he asserting about God?
He's strong and he's able to defend you.
Yeah.
Because that's what a castle does.
Yeah, that's the function of a castle, right? You go in there for protection, right? So if he is a rock, and he's a fortress, and he's a deliverer, what is he ultimately saying that God can do?
Give you protection.
Defeated.
Protect him, take care of him. Okay, think about the context of who David is. Is David an impressive individual? I would say, yeah, 100%. Like, there's a reason why we've devoted like a year to studying his life. Yes, he's a super impressive individual. He's a man after God's own heart. Hearing these words coming from a guy like this means a lot, right? It's one thing if if there's just some wimpy little guy who's never accomplished anything, and he's like, yeah, God can take care of me. It's like, okay, well I guess that means something, right? I mean, good. It's good that he came to realize that. But David is like this macho man, manliest of all the dudes. He goes out here and he's like out there slaying giants. People probably don't think that this guy needs protection. So if he's asserting that Yahweh is my rock and fortress and deliverer, what is he claiming about his life?
He can't do it without God's help.
Yeah, he's like basically saying, anything you've seen me do, it was not done by my own power. The only reason I was able to do it is because God was with me, right? He is my rock. He's my fortress. He's my deliverer. He is the reason why David could go out there so confidently to face Goliath despite the fact he had no armor on. Because he's like, the armor I need is God, right? He's my rock. Ironically, how did David kill Goliath? With a rock, right? So like, God is the one who fights David's battles. That's what he's asserting, right? And you have to remember who David is in order to appreciate this. He is the king. He is the warrior. He is like the best at everything he does. And he says, I owe it all to Yahweh. And he emphasizes that with each line. My God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. Who takes refuge in Yahweh? David. He says, I go to him for protection, right? That's why you have to go to refuge, right? You have to go to, you seek refuge when you need protection, right? David was going there. If this is read in the context of him fleeing from Saul and stuff, well, he's been living in caves and stuff. But he doesn't say, I go dwell in caves for refuge. He says, no. The real place I go for refuge is God. He's my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold, and my refuge. He's just repeating the same language. But it's also the same language that Hannah used in 1 Samuel chapter 2. My heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted in Yahweh. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies because I am glad in your salvation. Wow. It's almost like that's exactly what David is doing. Right? Hannah was saying, I exalt in you, God. My salvation is found in you. And David is saying, when I look back on what God has done for me, I exalt in him. Right? It's the same exact thought. I call, my Savior, you save me from violence. So here David has been delivered from his enemies. He's been delivered from Saul. And everybody would probably be like, man, David, you are just the coolest dude in the world. I don't know how you did it. And what is David's response?
You.
He's like, I didn't do it. God did it. You saved me from violence. There were multiple opportunities where David could have taken Saul's life. And he could have delivered himself from violence. But that would have taken the glory away from God. And that would have required David to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so David said, no, I'm not going to do that. Because David wanted God to get the glory. And if David was going to be exalted to the throne of Israel, he wasn't going to force his way. God had to put him there. And so David says, you're my Savior, you saved me from violence. David's a warrior, but ultimately God's the one who saves him. I call upon Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. Okay, tracking with Hannah's song, what is the next thing she says? My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I am glad in your salvation. He just said, my Savior, you saved me from violence. So he's boasting over his enemies because he's glad in salvation. And then she goes on to say, there is no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. He's been talking about God as his rock, and her conclusion was that there's no one holy like God. And what does he say? I call upon Yahweh, who is worthy to be praised. Right? Same thought. And I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me. The torrents of vileness terrorized me. The cords of Sheol surrounded me. The snares of death confronted me. What imagery is he portraying?
His enemies surrounding him.
That's what he's literally talking about. But what's the imagery? We're talking poetry here. There is imagery with this. He's asking you to picture something. What are you supposed to be picturing?
It's like drowning.
He's drowning, right? He is a man drowning in water, right? And with each line, he gets deeper and deeper. The waves of death encompassed me. Okay, so he was on the surface. The waves pushed him under. The torrents of vileness terrorized me. So now there's a storm going on, and the storm and the waves are pushing him deeper and deeper. The cords of Sheol surrounded me. What is Sheol? It's the grave, the place of the dead. Oftentimes, Sheol is described as an abyss. Right? We recently were just looking at the news about these people in the Titanic submersible thingy. Right? That's what David's describing right here. Right? Being down in the depths of water. Right? In the deep abyss where it's pitch black and it's terrifying. That's one thing that honestly, that whole Titanic thing, like, that led me to a lot of reflection because there's so many ways that we have advanced as societies, but there's certain things about God's nature that we just will never be able to overcome, right? I mean, one thing is like weather, right? Weather, we still can't control it, and we can have like news anchors who like, they'll say, it's going to rain today, and then it won't rain, and they'll be like, it's going to be sunny today, and then it'll rain, right? We can't control weather, but also the ocean. It is something that we still can't explore to a great extent, and it is still just as terrifying to us nowadays as it was back in David's day, right? And that's just something that's just universal. Like whenever we went with the youth people to Galveston, Sean and I were just looking at the horizon, and I was like, Sean, and this was before the whole Titanic thing. It was like the day before, I think. I was looking, I was like, the water terrifies me. Like I love swimming in water. I think water is great. But the ocean itself is a terrifying image because of how vast it is and how dark it is and how much unknown there is. Like you can look at the sky and you can at least see, oh look, there's a bird. The water is a mystery. And so oftentimes the Psalms will use that imagery to describe being in the midst of a battle. right? Because when you're in the midst of a battle, death is surrounding you. You're surrounded by darkness. You don't know when your life is going to be taken. It's the imagery of being lost at sea, right? So here he is. The waves of death encompassed him. The torrents of violence terrorized him. The cords of Sheol surrounded him, right? It's the imagery almost of sinking in the depths and being entangled in seaweed, right? And it's Sheol itself, death itself, is about to choke him out. The snares of death confronted me. And you see each of those: encompassed, terrorized, surrounded, confronted, right? Yeah, it's face to face, right? He is right there. Death is imminent. And this is true to the story, right? I mean, it sounds like...
It's like that one, I forget what chapter it is, but David says, like, death's but like a step behind me or something. Or I'm like a step ahead of death.
Yeah, I don't remember what chapter it is, but it sounds like something David would say.
Right before he has to flee.
Oh, okay.
He's talking to Jonathan.
Yeah. But like I was going to say that this is true to David's experience. Like, a lot of times people read the Psalms, they're like, man, David's so, like, he speaks so hyperbolically. No, he doesn't. This dude had a difficult life. Like, he was on the run for like 10 years from one of his mentor figures who also happened to be like the king. And so he had everybody chasing after him, and he had to learn to live on the run. And so he constantly felt like death was at his doorstep. And even in the places where he felt like he could deliver himself, morally speaking, in his conscience, he could not allow himself to deliver his own self. And so it almost felt like God was the one allowing him to die. And he says, there I was. I was at the brink of death. And if you remember the story, he was actually with the Philistines getting ready to go march against King Saul. Right? So it felt like things were coming to a head. But then all of a sudden, they say, we don't want you to fight with us. And then Saul goes and dies. And so here he is, coming face to face with death, and then boom, sudden deliverance. The waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of violence surrounded me, the cords of Sheol surrounded me, the snares of death confronted me. And you have to ask, how did he respond? Right? Because that's ultimately what Hannah was praying about. Right? She says, okay, there's two ways to respond to God. You either call upon him, or you rebel against him. Those who call upon him will be saved. Those who rebel against him, they're going to have fun in Sheol. So David says, I was almost there. In my distress, I called upon Yahweh, and I called to my God. And out of his temple he heard my voice, and my cry for help came into his ears. What's interesting about that verse? I mean, there's a bunch of stuff interesting, but there should be one thing that really sticks out to us as curious. Temple. Why is that interesting, Sean?
Because it hasn't been built.
Yeah, it hasn't been built yet. David wanted to build a temple, but remember God was like, yeah, no, that's for your son to do. He actually never even said that in 2 Samuel. In Chronicles, he says that's for your son to do. But in Samuel, he's like, no, you don't need to build me a house. And so there technically is no temple for David to call out to, but what is the imagery of a temple? It's a place of worship, but more specifically, why is it a place of worship? What's the significance of a temple?
Where God where God resides.
Yeah, it's the house of God. It's where God resides. And so there's no physical temple that David's able to call out to. So what is he doing? If there's no physical temple, but we know what a temple represents, what is he asking for?
Deliverance?
Yes, but why does he talk about temple imagery? This is a question y'all already answered. This isn't a trick question. What's this?
His presence?
Yes, he wants the presence of God near him, right? Which is him admitting, I can't deliver myself, right? He's calling upon Yahweh, and he says, from his temple, Yahweh heard him. And my cry for help came to his ears. So God's in his temple, which if there's no physical temple, then the only thing he could be referring to is either the tabernacle, like with the Ark of the Covenant, or heaven itself, right? So whichever one he's talking about, the imagery is of David sinking into the depths. So no matter what, if he's at the bottom of the water, I mean, that's pretty far away from both heaven and from the tabernacle. But God heard him there. And the idea is that David called out because he wants God to come near. Because David realizes that God's nearness is the thing that produces salvation. Here's another deep dive that hopefully a lot of people in this Bible study will be familiar with. The imagery that David uses here is not unique to his song, but there's another song that we have studied in this Bible study group, but it was a long time ago when we studied it. It wasn't written yet at this time period, but it's going to come a little bit later in the Old Testament. There's another song that somebody sings that is very similar to David's. Do you know what it is?
I would assume Jonah.
Yeah.
That's what it reminded me of because of like the abyss, the water.
Yeah, same imagery. Let me go read Jonah's song in Jonah chapter 2. We're going to be jumping all over the Bible, right? This is whenever Jonah was cast over the boat, and he is literally sinking to the depths. And God sends a fish, of all things, to go and swallow him, right? Then Jonah prayed to Yahweh, his God, from the stomach of the fish. And he said, I called out of my distress to Yahweh, and he answered me. I cried for help from the belly of Sheol. You heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current surrounded me. All your breakers and waves passed over me. So I said, I have been driven away from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to my very soul. The great deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the base of the mountains. The earth with its bars closed behind me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Yahweh my God. While my soul was fainting within me, I remembered Yahweh, and my prayer came to you, to your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their loving kindness, but as for me, I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. Whenever Jonah sang that song, do you think that maybe he had David's song also in mind? Right? Probably. Right? David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. Yeah, it's probably true that the prophet of God, centuries later, was thinking of David and being like, how did David respond in this situation? And he's probably using the same imagery. All right, so there's the first 7 verses, right? David is sinking, and he's sinking, and he's sinking, and he calls out to God, and it says that God heard his prayers. So what do you think God's going to do?
Help him out.
Probably help him out. It's not like God's going to like hear it and be like, looks like David's in a bad situation, and then just like, anyways, and like do something else. No. He only mentions God hearing because God's about to do something. So we go on. Sean, take it away.
Then the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of heaven were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens and came down with thick darkness under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew, and he appeared upon the wings of the wind. And he made darkness canopies around him, a mass of waters, thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him, coals of fire were kindled. Yahweh thundered from heaven, and the Most High gave forth his voice. And he sent out arrows, and scattered them, lightning, and threw them into confusion.
Sweet.
Our God is an awesome
Our God is an awesome God. Yeah. When he rolls up his sleeves, he ain't just putting on the Ritz. Yeah. There's lightning in his footsteps and thunder in his fists. Or is it, there's thunder in his footsteps and lightning in his fists?
Yeah.
I think it's that one. I don't know. Yeah, so what does God do?
He comes down.
He shows up on the scene and everything changes, right? Here David was, like the imagery is of God showing up, and like if David is the one sinking down at the depths of the waters, God is showing up in a greater storm, right? David was being enveloped by a storm. God is showing up in a greater storm that is destroying the other storm and parting the waters to grab David out from them, right? That is the imagery right here. So here David is sinking deeper and deeper. And once again, it's all imagery, right? There's never a point, as far as I know, in David's life where he was literally sinking in depths. It's imagery for what was happening in battle, right? He was surrounded by his enemies, and he called out for help, and God showed up and saved him. But for David, it's not enough to simply say, and then God saved me. No, he needs to help people understand the holiness of God. Then the earth shook and quaked. The foundations of heaven were trembling and were shaken because he was angry. Why would God be angry?
There's violence being intended toward David.
Yeah, but why would God care that violence was being done towards David?
Because he's
the
the
king.
Lord's anointed.
He's the Lord's anointed,
Mhm.
right? And nobody dare oppose the Lord's anointed. And so David is sinking, and he cries out to God. And God's like, somebody's doing something to my anointed one? Oh, they're screwed. And so God shows up, which is exactly what Hannah said, right? The horn of the anointed one will be established, right? The strength of the king will be made known. David cries out, and God shows up on the scene to establish his anointed one. The earth shook and quaked. The foundations of heaven were trembling and were shaken because he was angry, right? It's the imagery of a storm showing up. But as the storm rolls in, David says, that's God's anger, right? And you can feel that. Like whenever, last Wednesday, whenever we were leaving Dairy Queen, like we just stood outside and we're like, this is a powerful storm. Like the lightning and stuff, it almost feels like God is angry. You're like, whoa. You don't want to be on the receiving end of those blasts. Smoke went up out of his nostrils, right? I've talked about this. I don't know if I've talked about it with y'all, but whenever the Bible describes God being slow to anger, you know what the Hebrew word means? It means he's long of nose, right? That's literally what it means. We just translate it as slow to anger because long of nose sounds weird. But the imagery is that God has a really big nose, and so it takes a long time for his nostrils to begin flaring in anger, right? So God has a really big nose, and we should be grateful for that, right? He is long of nose. But right here, smoke went up out of his nostrils. The God who is slow to anger, he's mad, and he's furious. And if you can make a God like this mad, then you know you messed up. Smoke went up out of his nostrils, and fire from his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. Like God's literally it's like a fire-breathing dragon showing up. He bowed the heavens and came down with thick darkness under his feet. The imagery is of God riding the clouds, and the heavens themselves bow down closer to the earth so that God can just step down. Right? It's a beautiful image. He rode on a cherub and flew, and he appeared upon the wings of the wind. This is going to be important for us. Like this imagery is crucial for us, just biblically speaking. God is always the one depicted as riding on the clouds, and throughout a lot of the Psalms that we have in the Bible, God is always the one who shows up on the clouds, riding on the wings of the wind. And that's why it's super significant later on, whenever you get to the book of Daniel. This really doesn't have to do with what we're covering here. It's just worth noting. When you get to the book of Daniel, and Daniel says that he saw one like a son of man who was riding on the clouds, and he rides up to the Ancient of Days and receives from him dominion and honor and glory to judge the earth. Because if you realize that, you're like, wait a second. Like Daniel says that he sees somebody who looks like a man, but he's doing what God does, right? He is riding on the clouds, and then he comes up to the Ancient of Days, which is God. So you have this guy who is a man doing what only God does, yet he comes up to God and receives glory and honor and dominion to judge the earth. And you're like, well, that's weird. So God, who looks like a man, came up to God and received something from God? But only God has the authority to judge the earth. And so it's like God came up to God and received from God what only God can have. And for some reason, the one God looked like a person. And it's just this really weird thing about the Son of Man. And then Jesus shows up on the scene. And what does he always call himself? Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man. And then finally, whenever he's standing before the high priest, and the high priest is saying, are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? Jesus is staying totally silent until the high priest says, I adjure you in the name of the living God. Are you the Messiah? He says, you better answer me. And Jesus basically says, I'll do you one better than that. He says, yeah, I'm the Son of Man. And he says, and I tell you, the next time you see me, I'm going to be riding on the clouds. And so basically he says, I'm not just the Messiah. I'm God in the flesh. I'm the one who's the judge of all the earth, and you might be judging me right now, but I'm going to be judging you next time. And that's why the high priest rips his garments and says he's committed blasphemy and sentences him to death. Right? It's because Jesus is using this imagery to describe himself. He says, yeah, the Son of Man, God, that's me. And so that's just an important thing for us to note, right? The imagery of the person riding on the clouds, that is always God. And so it's important for us to recognize that because it helps us understand better who Jesus is claiming to be. He bowed the heavens and came down with thick darkness under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. Also throughout the Old Testament, you hear about cherubim and stuff like that. Cherubim are not like little naked babies with wings. That's kind of how we picture them in like a lot of art. They're a lot different creatures than that. But typically, whenever you see, like especially later on in the prophets, whenever they have visions of the throne room of God, cherubim are underneath the throne of God. Right? So if he is flying on the cherubim, it's the idea of God riding on his throne, which is almost like a, like in ancient days, whenever like kings would be carried on like they would be carried on like the seat, like through places. That's the idea. The cherubim are carrying the throne of God as he rides majestically in to save David. He rode on a cherub and flew, and he appeared upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness canopies around him, a mass of waters, thick clouds of the skies. Right? So the idea is this huge storm rolling in. From the brightness before him, coals of fire were kindled. Yahweh thundered from heaven, and the Most High gave forth his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning, and threw them into confusion. So what does God show up and do?
Causes confusion.
How? What's the imagery?
I like to think of a thunderstorm.
Yeah.
Because it's like, he thundered from heaven, gave forth his voice, sent lightning, and threw them into confusion. I see that.
Yeah, and so it's really cool because we realize that David is he's talking about himself sinking and God showing up as a storm, but the metaphor is for battle, right? And so if God shows up, metaphorically, he is shooting weapons, and the weapons are bolts of lightning. Oh, I don't know about you, but there's not really a good defense against lightning. It's not like you could none of us have like Captain America's shield where you just like block that. Like no, you're being destroyed by this, and that is how David views his enemies, right? Whenever he calls out to God and God comes to help him, there's nothing the enemies can do to avoid being destroyed. And this, if you understand this is David's mentality towards warfare, you can understand why little shepherd David could stand and face a giant all by himself. Because he's like, yeah, you come to me with swords and shields. I come to you in the name of the Lord of angel armies, who is literally riding here with his chariot, a chariot carried by cherubim, and he's about to just smite you with lightning, right? And this tiny little rock right here is all I need to destroy you, right? This is just David's mentality about this. But we move on. Take it away, Sean.
Then the channels of the sea appeared. The foundations of the world were laid bare by the rebuke of Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but Yahweh was my support. He brought me forth also into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. Yahweh has rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands he has recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of Yahweh, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and as for his statutes, I did not depart from them.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, so continuing with the imagery of David sinking and the storm arriving, what does God do? He what?
Deliverance.
He delivers him, but what's the imagery?
It's almost like the parting of the sea.
He parts the waters. I wonder if there's a song that people sang to God after he parted waters in another similar instance.
Parting of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
In Exodus.
If you go to Exodus chapter 14, God parts the Red Sea and the people walk through on dry ground. Do you know what Exodus chapter 15 is?
It's the song Moses sang.
It's a song sang to God. Maybe it's worth reading that song too to see if there's parallels, right? I told you, we're going to be all over the place because this really is bringing like a lot of stuff to a conclusion. And we also see that David is doing something that the Bible is constantly going to do with the kings of Israel. It is going to put, like, God is going to consciously put the kings of Israel in places where they are almost reliving the story of the people of Israel. And we see how they respond. Right? So David, he was young And then he eventually kind of had this whole Exodus moment with King Saul, right? Where he was fleeing, but then eventually God delivered him. And the way God delivers him, he parts waters. And he goes back into the land, right? And then David's going to be in the land for a while, and eventually he's going to do some bad stuff that eventually leads to some consequences, that eventually leads to Absalom rebelling against him, and he has to flee the land again. And then he comes back in. It's almost like the people of Israel going into exile, right? Which is future, right? And so David's life, in many ways, parallels the story of the people of Israel, right? When he was young, he has to flee. He comes back into the land. Whenever he's older, he commits some sin. He has to flee. He comes back into the land. And so I don't think it's a surprise that David's going to call back to the imagery. And we're going to go read that passage in a second as well. But first, let's just break it down here. So God shows up on the scene. He's flashing lightning, destroying David's enemies. And then the channels of the sea appeared. The foundations of the world were laid bare by the rebuke of Yahweh at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. So what's the imagery?
Should it be like water, like just laying bare the armies of the Philistines?
Okay, so it's not the water being laid bare.
Is it like breathing like it?
Yes, the imagery is of God breathing out from his nostrils, and he's so powerful that the waters are forced apart, and the ground is laid bare, right? The channels, like you can see the sea floor, which is helpful because where's David at currently in the imagery of the song?
The sea floor.
He's at the bottom of the sea, right? He has been sinking underneath his enemies, and with the breath of his nostrils, God scatters the enemies in order for him to retrieve David. He's sent from on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. Right? So that's the imagery. David is sinking. He's sinking. He's sinking. God shows up like a mighty storm, and in his fury, he breathes out of his nostrils. He doesn't have to do anything major. He just breathes, and the waters, and then he grabs David and lifts him up. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. So if all these people are like, wow, David, how did you possibly do all of this stuff? You have been delivered from King Saul. You know, all the tabloid reporters of the 10th century BC come up to David. Tell us your story. How did you do it? How did you evade him all these years? David says, I didn't do anything. If it was just me, Saul would have gotten me a long time ago. God delivered me. And don't you forget it. Right? That's what David's suggesting here. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. So, just to recap the context of what David is suggesting, he found himself in a situation where his enemies were on one side, and he was encompassed in water, and he had no way out. And then God breathed from his nostrils, and he was delivered. Let's go to Exodus chapter 15 and see if that imagery sounds similar to the Red Sea thing. Then Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song to Yahweh and said, I will sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will extol him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are sunk in the Red Sea. The deeps cover them. They went down to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Yahweh, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Yahweh, shatters the enemy. And in the greatness of your exaltation, you pull down those who rise up against you. You sent forth your burning anger, and it devours them as chaff. And at the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be fulfilled against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will dispossess them. You blew with your wind, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, fearsome in praises, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness you have guided the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have led them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Anguish has seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. The leaders of Moab, trembling, seizes them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm they are still a stone. Until your people pass over, O Yahweh, until the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Yahweh, which you have made for you to inhabit. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Yahweh shall reign forever and ever. Well, that gives us some context for this, right? Because we have the same imagery. So David is clearly calling back to that story, right? God breathes from his nostrils, the waters part, they pile up so that God can deliver his people. And ultimately, that song ends with God, with Moses and the people saying, God, you will lead your people to the place where your presence will dwell. Well, David is delivered from Saul, and what are some of his first orders of business once he becomes king? He establishes Jerusalem. He brings his Ark of the Covenant to sit there, right? And so David is fulfilling the song of Moses. And it seems like he's anticipating that right here, because he's saying, God, just like you delivered your people from the Red Sea, so you've also delivered me from the hands of my enemies. Whenever Saul and his armies were pursuing me, I was surrounded, I was sinking, and you parted the waters to save me from drowning. They confronted me, verse 19, they confronted me in the day of my disaster, but Yahweh was my support. He brought me forth also into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. So now you see the progression of the thought. Why did God rescue David? He delighted in him.
His love for him.
Yeah. He really liked David. David had a special place in his heart, which is something that we know, right? Of course, God had a very special place in his heart for David. He delighted in him. The imagery of being brought into a broad place, it's a lot safer to be in a broad place than it is to be lost in the middle of the sea or to be standing on the edge of a cliff, right? A broad place is a place of safety. Yahweh has rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he has recompensed me. Okay. Now, this is where we kind of face some difficulties. What is David saying here? Or why would I say that there's difficulties here?
David's hands aren't clean.
His hands aren't clean. And you could argue, and you could say, well, to be fair, at the point when he wrote this song, his hands were pretty clean. I mean, like, whenever he was delivered from Saul, he hadn't really, I mean, he'd sinned, but he hadn't done the David and Bathsheba thing yet. Right? So you could make that argument, but the issue is, that's not when the narrator chooses to quote this song. Right? The narrator, I mean, regardless of when David wrote it, the narrator has already told us the whole story, and he chooses to put the psalm right here, which means that the reader knows that David's hands are not clean, and so are we supposed to view David as a liar? I don't think so, because that would kind of make his entire psalm moot. So instead, we have to read this differently, and we have to figure out what exactly David is claiming here, because somehow he can do this thing with Bathsheba, and his entire life can be a mess by the end of it all, yet still he can say that God has rewarded him according to his righteousness. So what is David actually claiming here?
He's saying that he's washed clean by the blood of Jesus. Kind of.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't have that language for it, but I think that ultimately is the idea. I think that whenever David talks about righteousness, it's not a righteousness that comes from himself. It's a righteousness that comes ultimately from the fact that God delights in him. And he has placed his faith in God. And when he has sinned, he has repented. Right? Because guess what? The David and Bathsheba thing was not the first time David sinned. And so even prior to all that, he still was not righteous in and of himself. And David was a man after God's own heart, so he probably knew his sinfulness. And we even saw him mess up in 1 Samuel. Right? So he messed up plenty of times. And so when he's talking about his righteousness right here, we're not supposed to think of it in terms of sinless perfection. I think it's just a righteousness that he has received from God. God views him this way because of his faith in Yahweh and his trust in God's promises.
Kind of like Abraham.
Exactly. Yeah, it's God, like Abraham believed in God and it was counted to him as righteousness. David, flawed as he may be, he never lost sight of God. And when he did lose sight, he immediately, like once he was called out on it, he immediately went back to God. right? And if he needed to offer sacrifices, he would offer sacrifices. And if he knew a sacrifice wouldn't cut it, he offered a broken heart, right? So that's who David was. And so even though he wasn't always the perfect individual, he can still look back on his life, whether it was the original context of this or at the end of 2 Samuel, and you can still say, according to my righteousness, he rewarded me, and according to the cleanness of my hands, he recompensed me. Yeah, David's hands might not be clean, but in God's eyes, they are clean, because God has forgiven him for all those things. And when he did mess up, he followed the law, and he submitted to whatever God said, and he demonstrated that his devotion was to God, and he genuinely repented for what he'd done. And so it's really him exalting God even more, right? Because not only has God delivered him from his enemies, but God was able to deliver him from his sins to such a degree that he could say, God has rewarded me for my righteousness. And he delighted in me, despite the fact that he'd done some not great things. For I have kept the ways of Yahweh, and I have not wickedly departed from my God. So right there, he kind of defines what he means. When he says, my righteousness, he's not saying, I was a perfect individual. No, I kept the ways of Yahweh. I didn't depart from God, right? And that's going to be the testimony of David. Whenever you go forward into 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, all the other kings will be compared to David. And the main comparison will be, did they turn to other gods, right? And if they did, it'll say they did not walk in the ways of David, but instead they turned to other gods and they looked left and right. However, if the people are faithful, they'll say they walked in the ways of David their father, and they looked neither left nor right, but always kept their eyes on Yahweh, right? So they never departed to idolatry. They never turned to somewhere else for a source of salvation. When they messed up, they always turned back to God. That's what David means. I kept the ways of Yahweh. When I messed up, I turned back to him. I have not wickedly departed from my God. That, to David, is the definition of unrighteousness, right? To look anywhere other than God. To depart from God, that is wickedness. But as long as you are faithful to God, then you can be called righteous, because it's faith in him, right? It's not about the actual just moral actions. For all his judgments were before me, and as for his statutes, I did not depart from them, right? So, as a God-fearing Israelite, how does David demonstrate his faithfulness to Yahweh? By obeying the law, right? That's how he does it, right? Jesus says the same thing to us. If you love me, do my commands, right? That's how we demonstrate our faith. We'll talk about this when we get to the book of James, right? Faith without works is dead. Works are not the thing that produce salvation, but they're the things that testify to the fact that you have a faith that is saving, right? And so that's what David's laying out there. So God saved him because he rejoiced in God, and he looked to him. In the day of his distress, he didn't look to Baal, he didn't look to all the other gods, he didn't look to Dagon, he didn't look to any of those. In the day of his distress, he called upon Yahweh. And Yahweh says, that's my boy. I'll come get you.
I was also blameless toward him, and I kept myself from my iniquity. Therefore Yahweh has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness before his eyes. With the kind you show yourself kind, with the blameless you show yourself blameless, with the pure you show yourself pure, and with the crooked you show yourself astute. And you say of an afflicted people, but your eyes are on the haughty whom you bring down. For you are my lamp, O Yahweh. In Yahweh illumines my darkness. For by you I can run upon a troop. By my God I can leap over a wall. As for God, his way is blameless. The word of Yahweh is tried. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. For who is God but Yahweh? And who is a rock but our God?
Very good, very good. All right, so what does David communicate here?
That God is his lamp.
Yeah, why is that interesting?
Because, chapter 2 ago, David talked about him being the lamp.
Well, it wasn't necessarily
Well, not him,
David who
but-
talked about that.
Not him, but
His troops.
yes.
Remember, they said, if you die, the lamp of Israel is being extinguished. So, I don't think that's an accident, right? In the very last, that was last week's chapter, right? In last week's chapter, towards the end of the chapter, we have David's troops turning to him and saying that you are the lamp of Israel. And then now, what does David say about God?
He's the lamp.
He is the lamp of David.
Mhm.
So, God is the lamp of lamps, right? David is the lamp of Israel, and God is the lamp of Israel, right? Which is a really good sign, right? Because what did Hannah pray for, right? What was her song about? It was about a king and an anointed one who would rejoice in God and look to him, right? And for that person who took refuge in God, he would be exalted and his strength would be established. That's exactly what David did, right? That is what David's experiencing here is the fulfillment of Hannah's prayer. I was also blameless toward him, and I kept myself from iniquity. And you can look at that and you'd be like, well, David, no, you didn't. Okay, yeah, I know. He's not saying he was perfect, right? And all you have to do is go read some of David's other Psalms to realize that, right? And we did that as we went through this whole thing. We stopped, and sometimes we would go through like Psalm 51, where David's like, man, I messed up, right? So David's not claiming to be perfect. He is simply saying that, in general, he tried to keep himself from sin. And whenever he did sin, he turned back to God. Therefore Yahweh has recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness before his eyes. And then he goes and he establishes some general principles about the character of God. With the kind, you show yourself kind. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the pure, you show yourself pure. And with the crooked, you show yourself astute. What other translations do y'all have? For that last line right there. Yeah, we'll just what does it say at the bottom of verse 27?
And with the devious, you will show yourself shrewd.
You'll show yourself shrewd. What else we got?
Astute, perverted.
Astute, perverted.
You make yourself seem torturous.
Torturous, yeah. See all these words, like all those words, you might notice they're not positive words. And that's because it's not supposed to be a positive thing. The word, I believe the word most closely means twisted. Right? And the idea is that, what a man sows, he shall also reap. Right? So, with the kind, you show yourself kind. Obviously, this is not like a thing where it's like, oh, I was kind to this person this one time, and I didn't feel the kindness of God. Okay, you might not have felt it, but God was still kind to you. Right? Like that's the thing we have to realize. David's not speaking about just how you feel, because guess what? David just said, you have to read it in the context of the whole psalm, right? He just said, God, I was faithful to you, and I was righteous, and you left me drowning in the depths for a while. And that might not sound very kind, but David is still saying, you show yourself kind to those who are kind, right? And so you have to realize this isn't talking about how life circumstances feel. It is simply David making commentary about how God is, whether you feel it or not. Because David probably felt I don't think he enjoyed being on the run for 10 years. However, when he's delivered, he's like, God, you are amazing. And even if I didn't feel it, this is who you are. Yes?
You may feel in a bad situation on the outside, like things are going bad, and if a good God was, good, why are these things happening to me? No, it's how you are as a person inside.
Yeah.
Well,
the thing is,
yourself.
To an extent, but I don't even know if David necessarily felt good inside the whole time. I think David was struggling for a lot of it. If you read some of his Psalms that he wrote when he was on the run, he was having a tough time. And he was like, God, where are you? I can't feel you. I want you nearby, but it feels like you're not there. I think this is just David asserting theological truths, regardless of how you feel. And he's able to say these things in his deliverance, right? And now that he's been delivered from his enemies, he can say, these things are true. I might not have felt it at the time, but I know them to be true now, right? And ultimately, he's laying the groundwork so that future generations can know these things always, right? David learned these the hard way, but now he's laying it down. He's going to say, the word of Yahweh is tried, right? What God says, it will be. And so he has personally experienced it, and he's recounting this in psalm form so that we also can believe in it. Does that make sense? So, with the kind, you show yourself kind. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. With the pure, you show yourself pure. But with the crooked, you show yourself astute, perverted, twisted, right? For the people who are crooked and the people who try to cheat other people, well, you're going to cheat them, right? If they're out here and they're trying to live in a twisted manner and they're always trying to one-up other people, well, you might make them think that they're being successful, and you might allow them to get tastes of success. But in the end, You'll pull the rug from under them. And you'll show that they were the ones who were really being cheated the whole time. They thought that they were going to succeed. They thought they were going to win. But because their hearts were devious, you chose to be devious back. And in the end, it was the person that they were going to cheat that ends up coming out on top. Right? And that might not even happen until they die. Right? And that might not come till the day of judgment. But this is what David is asserting about God. That which a man sows, he will also reap. You get what you ask for. And you save an afflicted people, but your eyes are on the haughty, whom you bring down. Once again, what does haughty mean?
Proud.
Proud, right? So he's establishing these principles about who God is, and it really is remarkable that God is like this. This is something that we kind of take for granted, but the idea that the God who exists and who is over all things would for some reason favor the lowly people. That's interesting, right? You save an afflicted people, right? He roots for the underdog, right? And he has compassion towards them. And I think it's just a general principle about God. He does not like it whenever people abuse power. And if he sees somebody who is lowly and afflicted, he is going to be more gracious and compassionate and merciful towards them because he realizes that their circumstances are not ideal. And he will come to their aid. Whereas the people who are prospering and their lives are easier because of that luxury, he's going to be stricter on them. Which I think should be a message to us, because a lot of the times we like to view ourselves as the lowly and afflicted ones, but usually the lowly and afflicted stuff that we attribute to ourselves are things that we're forced to assume about ourselves because we want to be the ones who are favored by God. We're like, ooh, God favors the lowly and afflicted. Let me find some ways in my life where I'm lowly and afflicted. It's like, or just look at your life honestly and figure out where you're at. And if you find yourself in a position where you are one of the more privileged people, realize that God's going to hold you accountable for that. And how you handle that is going to say something about you. And so, like, it doesn't mean that it's better to be one or the other. It just means that those who are lowly and afflicted, God in general is going to, he's going to be more compassionate towards them because they've got a little more excuses. Whereas the people who had privileged lives, they received all that from God. But most often, they're the ones who don't give him the glory. Right? Whereas the lowly and afflicted ones, they don't have anything, and they're more likely to turn to him. Whereas the people who have everything that they receive from God, they're so quick to get distracted and not pay him attention and give him the worship that he is due. He saves the afflicted, but his eyes are on the haughty who he brings down. So if you think that, if you've got pride, he'll take that pride away from you. He'll smack you to the ground a little bit. One of the scariest prayers to pray is, Lord, humble me. I've prayed that a few times, and I can't say I've regretted it, but I've regretted the wording sometimes. Nowadays, I'll usually be like, Lord, if possible, humble me gently. But I've learned from experience, I don't think it's possible to be humbled gently. I think usually we just need a punch to the face. But if you pray for God to humble you, he will do it. And it's usually a painful experience. But if you don't pray for it, he's still going to do it. But it probably won't be at a time when you would like it. For you are my lamp, O Yahweh, and Yahweh illumines my darkness. That imagery is just great. Right? Your word is a lamp unto my feet, a light unto my path. For by you I can run upon a troop. By my God I can leap over a wall. As for God, his way is blameless. The word of Yahweh is tried. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. So I think what he's doing here is he's actually communicating the same exact thing that he communicated at the beginning of the psalm. Now he's just making it more directly applicational. Right? So he's taking the imagery that was invoked at the beginning, and now he's explaining it in his own life. Right? So before it was the imagery of him sinking and being devoured by his enemies. But now he's explaining this, once again, imagine it was like a tabloid reporter, right? How did you do all this? Well, I didn't do it. God did it. What do you mean, David? You're the one who fought in that battle. I saw you kill Goliath. I saw you do this. I saw you do that. Well, let me explain. Allow me to use this imagery. Goliath was like a wave battering me down, and I was sinking in the depths. But then God came to me, and he delivered me. And so now he's going to explain that imagery. right? So God is the one equipping him to do it, but from an external perspective, David is the one actually accomplishing the victory. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not like David is saying that in some miraculous way, every single battle, like it wasn't like David like marched into battle and then like he would like raise a sword and then just like everybody would fall over dead. And everybody's like, wow, I guess God did that. It wasn't like that. If you were a person fighting in David's army, from all external perspectives, it looked like David was an amazing warrior. David is simply saying that it doesn't matter what it looks like. God is the one who gave me the victory, which is probably something for us all to learn application-wise, right? It doesn't matter how good of an employee you are. You've got to realize that all good things come from above, which is something we're going to talk about in the book of James. It's almost like we're setting it all up, right? It's crazy. It's almost like James had an Old Testament theology that he was building from whenever he wrote his book, right? All good things come from above, from God, the Father of lights. This imagery. God is the lamp. Crazy. So, what does David say? For by you I can run upon a troop. By my God I can leap over a wall. What is the imagery?
With God, I can do anything.
Yeah, with God I can do anything.
With God, all things are possible. Matthew.
Yeah, he's like, I can run upon a troop. One David versus a whole army? Piece of cake. I got it. With God, I can leap over a wall, just like barreling over stuff. But it's all very physical stuff, right? This is a physical thing David is doing, but he's saying, I do it not by my own strength, but by God. To invoke Paul's language later on, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. The emphasis is not on, wow, I can do all things. The emphasis is on, through Christ who gives me strength. Right? The emphasis is on God giving him the ability. As for God, his way is blameless. The word of Yahweh is tried. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. What is he saying about God there?
God is never wrong.
He's never wrong. And
You can run to him for help.
yes,
Safety.
Like he's proved himself.
he's proved himself. Interesting. So, if he's proved himself, like if you're just following the internal logic of this, it's the context of words, right? The word of Yahweh is tried, right? So if Yahweh's words have been proven true, what does that suggest about something happening in the past? I don't know if I worded that in a way that can guide y'all to an answer.
That is true.
It's steadfast, immovable.
Okay, in order for some, like if I were to, I'm trying to think how to word this because I don't want to just like say it because it's something that y'all can get to. In order for somebody's words to be proved true, what has to be given in the beginning?
Application? Prophecy?
The words. Yes, the words. Words can't be proven true unless words were given in the beginning. So, David is saying that all of this faith in Yahweh stems from something that God promised him. Right? Because like right now, if I were to go into a battlefield, there is nothing, biblically speaking, that has given me the confidence that if I charged in there, guns blazing, all by myself, I would come out alive. Right? There's nothing in the Bible. I mean, some Christians will try to say, they'll just be like, well, just trust God can do it. Well, I trust he can do it. That's not the problem. There's just nothing in the Bible that would suggest to me that he would do that for me. Because if I did it, it would probably be considered reckless. Right? Because why would I think, God would probably be like, yeah, I could save you, but I had other things planned for you than running into there recklessly, right? So if David is living his entire life doing these crazy things and performing these amazing feats, and he says it's all built on the word of Yahweh, it would imply that God has told him something and has made him some sort of promise that implies to him that he can do such things. Did that happen in David's life? Where?
God said he would be king, he became king.
There you go. Whenever David was a little teeny bopper, this guy named Samuel showed up and said, you're going to be the future king. Whenever David fought Goliath, guess what he wasn't yet? King. And so he's like, yeah, I can face Goliath. God made a promise to me, and God's going to tell the truth. And so if I go into this battlefield, there's no way that I lose as long as I'm being faithful to God. Because he's going to make me king. And so David had a promise from God that guaranteed that he'd be fine. Right? And so he went into it totally secure because he had a hope, and that hope would not put him to shame. And so he says, God's way is blameless. The word of Yahweh is tried. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Now, does this mean David was testing God? No. Right? There's a difference between testing God and trusting God. Right? He trusted God so surely that whenever he was going against Goliath, he wasn't like, all right, God, here's your opportunity to prove yourself true. This is not the equivalent of whenever the devil's like saying, hey, Jesus, throw yourself off the temple. And if you're the Son of God, he'll send somebody to protect you. That's not what David's doing. David is so confident in the promises of God that he trusts that he can go do this and he'll be fine. Right? Because he trusts that God will not let his anointed one be destroyed. And so it's a very healthy mindset. And he says, yeah, the word of God is tried. Yeah, it's been proven. Right? He's not a liar. For who is God but Yahweh, and who is a rock but our God? He said, who else can save you? He's like, God's the only one who can do it. We move on.
God is my strong fortress, and he sets the blameless in his way. He makes my feet like hinds' feet, and sets me on my high places. He trains my hands for battle, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have also given me the shield of your salvation, and your answer to me makes me great. You enlarge my steps under me, and my ankles have not given way. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. And I have consumed them and crushed them, so that they did not rise, and they fell under my feet. For you have girded me with strength for battle. You have subdued under me those who rose up against me. You have also made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed those who hated me. They looked, but there was none to save, even to Yahweh, but he did not answer them.
Very cool. Well, that's interesting. I mean, David seems to sound like he's the one saving himself. What's up with that? I pursued my enemies and destroyed them. I did not turn back till they were consumed. Who's the one saving him? Is it himself or is it God?
God.
How do you know that?
He gave him the ability to do that.
How do you know that?
He kind of makes it sound like God's doing all the work, basically. He's like, here you go.
Yes. The answer I was looking for, one word, context, right? That's the main thing I was looking for. Because yes, whenever he gets here, he's like, yeah, I did this, I did that, I won the battle. And it's like, wait, David, I thought God did all that. And he's like, well, yeah, I just said that. Just read the previous verses. Yes, you see me doing this, but it is God working through me that's accomplishing it. Right? So context is key. God is my strong fortress. He sets the blameless in his way. Why? Because he is blameless. Right? David said, I lived blamelessly, and he said, God is blameless. And if you're following with the theology of what he's established, well, with the kind, you show yourself kind. With the pure, you show yourself pure. With the blameless, you show yourself blameless. Right? God is my strong fortress. He sets the blameless in his way. He makes my feet like hinds' feet, and he sets me on high places. Talk about a contrast, right? He started off the song at the bottom of the depths, and as he approaches the end of the song, he's on like a high mountain, right? That's where God has put him. He retrieved him from sinking into the depths, and now he's given him a vantage point where he can look down on all of his enemies. He trains my hands for battle so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. David, what is your workout regimen? How did you get so toned and amazing? God. I can do all things through Yahweh who gives me strength. I'm on the Yahweh workout plan. What is he communicating with that? This is actually really profound, what he's saying. And it really sheds a lot of light on David's entire mentality towards all things in life. A mentality that we all need to learn and adopt.
Trusting God.
Okay?
To let God do what he wants to do in you throughout your life.
Mm-hmm.
I think it shows that God isn't just working in the exact moment whenever he's winning the battle. He's stepping up to the person that he's fighting God is not like just present there, but before, whenever he's like preparing, knowing that he's going to go into battle, like God is helping him then too. Like he's always helping him. It's not just like a one-time thing.
Yeah, it's exactly that. He's emphasizing how active a role God plays in his life, and it's not just God showing up here and there at select moments. He's like, no, God has been with me the entire time. It's not like he was just like some weak guy in the middle of the battle being like, hey God, I could really use your help, and then like God like supernaturally. It's not like I think like the imagery of like Mario like, you know, getting like the one like star or whatever where he starts like glowing and he's like all of a sudden superpowered. That's not what David did. No, he's saying God is the one who trained my hands. Like the reason I was able to go into battle and fight in the first place is because God was with me in the training. And the reason why my arms grew more muscular is because God enabled that to happen. And he is viewing every single aspect of his life as being empowered by God. And every single strength that he has is only a result of God graciously giving him the ability to have that. So if he is able to lift a heavy bow, that's because God gave him that strength. Right? Like that is cool, because a lot of times we kind of reduce God, like we have a very like naturalistic worldview, right? Where we just think in terms of like science, which is good. Science is fine. But you have to realize that the worldview of the Bible goes beyond just science. It is a worldview where God doesn't, it's not like God just like has key moments in life where, like key moments in history where he has intervened, right? Yes, there are key moments where he has intervened in a super powerful, obvious visual way, but the imagery of the Bible and the worldview of the Bible is that God is always intervening in every aspect of human history. And when you woke up in the morning and you were able to see with your eyes, it is only because God sustained your vision through the night. And it was only because he gave your eyelids the muscles to open. And it was only because your brain was given the strength and the power by him to process that you could see. Right? Like, that is the worldview of the Bible, where God is intimately involved in every aspect of life. Right? He's not just the watchmaker who set history in motion. He is the one who keeps the planets going around and around. He is the one who keeps us going. He is the one who keeps our hearts beating. It is literally him being involved in every aspect of it. And that's how David viewed his life.
It's like in Colossians versus like in all things are sustained.
Yes, yeah. Through him and by him and for him all things were made, and in him all things hold together. Right? God is the one sustaining everything. He didn't just create it, and he's not just going to bring it to an end. He is actively involved even right now. Like my ability to speak right now is only because God has chosen that it's okay for me to speak right now. And right now. And right now. That's how David's viewing this. He trains my hands for battle so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You also have given me the shield of your salvation, and your answer to me makes me great. What is the answer? Yes, I'll come save you. Right? You enlarge my steps under me, and my ankles have not given way. The idea is of his stride growing longer and longer. And even though he's gone through all this hardship, his ankles, he's not rolling his ankles and he's not getting brittle and broken. Instead, despite all of his hardship, God has toughened him up and made him stronger through it. Right? Count it joy when you face many trials, brothers. It's almost like that's what James is going to talk about. Right? It's almost like we're heading there. Right? Because ultimately, trials make us stronger. And that's what David's pointing out. He's like, yeah, like I went through all this stuff, but you actually strengthened me through it. And rather than coming out injured, I'm coming out better for it. And now he's better equipped to lead God's people after having been delivered from his enemies. You enlarged my steps under me, and my ankles have not given way. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. Right? I didn't need to take a rest break. I didn't have to come back and fight another day. No, you gave me full power to destroy them right then and there. And I have consumed them and crushed them so that they did not rise, and they fell under my feet. The interesting thing about this is that when you actually look at the battles, specifically if we're talking about Saul, David never fought in a battle against Saul. Right? And so you could say that maybe he's talking about the battles he fought elsewhere, or you could just suggest that maybe he's still using imagery. Right? And maybe the imagery is of him fighting a battle and destroying his enemies, even though in reality he never even had to raise a sword against Saul. Right? And so the imagery is of a battlefield now, but the imagery is just that. It's the same as him sinking in the depths. I have consumed them and crushed them, so they did not rise, and they fell under my feet. For you have girded me with strength for battle. Right? The idea of being girded, it's being clothed. You have clothed me with strength. Well, that's a pretty cool armor right there. What are you clothed in? Strength. You have subdued under me those who rose up against me. You also have made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed those who hated me. They looked, but there was none to save. Even to Yahweh, but he did not answer them. So in the context, he says that his enemies looked for somebody to help them, but nobody came to their aid. And this is the interesting part. These enemies even cried out to Yahweh himself. But what does Yahweh do?
He doesn't listen to them.
He doesn't answer. In contrast to who?
David.
David, earlier in the song, right? He was sinking, and he cried out to Yahweh, and from his temple, Yahweh heard, right? Yahweh wasn't even right next to him. Yahweh heard from a distance, and it was like super hearing. He's like, oh, David's in trouble, and he like immediately jumps into action. So God can hear people's cries, but he can also choose to not listen to them. Do we have evidence of this happening at some point in the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel?
Saul.
Yeah. Do y'all remember that? Right before Saul died, he finally remember, like we talked about this the whole time, right? Throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, we talked about this. Sorry, we're going to go a little over time. I said we'd be able to go through this quickly. Ha ha ha. We only have one more slide though. Don't worry. But we talked about this throughout all of 1st and 2nd Samuel. How the name Saul, Shaul in Hebrew, what does it mean? To ask, to inquire, right? And throughout the books, we've seen David is constantly Shauling of God. He inquires of God, and God answers him. But who never really Shauled of God? Saul, right? So David Shauled of God, but Shaul never Shauled of God, except for one time, near the end of his life, where he goes and he inquires of God, and it's the same word, Shaul, Shauled of God. And what does God do?
Does not answer.
He doesn't answer. It's exactly what David's talking about here, right? My enemies, they even cried out to Yahweh. He didn't answer. Because at that point, it was too late. And why does God not answer the enemies, according to David?
Because they're messing with the Lord's anointed?
Because they're messing with David.
Yeah.
Because God delights in David. And we know that God didn't delight in Saul anymore, right? God departed from Saul. He had taken the kingdom away. And so David would not touch Saul because Saul was the Lord's anointed. Saul had no problem trying to attack David, even though David was the Lord's anointed. And so all of a sudden, Yahweh's like, you don't mess with my boy David. And so now here, Saul has been killed, and David has been delivered, and he looks back and he sees the hand of Yahweh in all of it. He says, they even cried out to you, and you didn't answer. Which is remarkable, right? I mean, like usually we just think, oh, well, as long as you call out to God, God will come and help you. Well, it's better to call out sooner rather than later, right? Don't push God too far. End of the song.
Then I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I pulverized and stamped them as the mire of the streets. You have also delivered me from the contentions of my people. You have kept me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. Foreigners cower before me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. Yahweh lives, and blessed be my rock. And let God, the rock of my salvation, be lifted high, the God who executes vengeance for me and brings down peoples under me, who also brings me out from my enemies. You even lift me above those who rise up against me. You rescue me from violent man. Therefore I will give thanks to you, O Yahweh, among the nations, and I will sing praises to your name. He gives great salvation to his king, and shows loving kindness to his anointed, to David and his seed forever.
What does that ending kind of sound like? It sounds like the ending of Hannah's song, doesn't it? Talks about the king, talks about the Mashiach. It's almost like it was intentional by the author. The author's like, wow, these two songs have a lot of similar things. What if I structured the entire story of 1st and 2nd Samuel around these two songs? And sure enough, if you look at the story that you find in between 1 Samuel chapter 2 and 2 Samuel 22, every aspect of the story is reinforcing these points, right? How you treat the Lord's anointed one, very important. How you treat the anointed one is indicative of your response to God, right? Even if you are the Lord's anointed one, right? David, he was an anointed one of God, yet he still respected Saul. And therefore, that shows that he was faithful to Yahweh. Saul was an anointed one. He had no respect for David, right? And so we see that he was not loyal to Yahweh, right? And so all of the themes established in these two songs are being explained in the middle. Then I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I pulverized and stomped them as the mire of the streets. Very intense imagery. You have also delivered me from the contentions of my people. You have kept me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. David was just some random shepherd from backwoods Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a tiny little town. And it continued to be a tiny little town even after the time of David. It didn't become a big deal until after Jesus was born. And all of a sudden everybody's like, whoa, Jesus was born there. Bethlehem was a tiny little town. Nobody knew who David was. David didn't know that many people. He literally grew up in the shepherd's field. He probably knew like a handful of people. But now he says, God, I've been on the run for like 10 years. And somehow you've kept me as the head of the nations. Not only over Israel, but over the nations, plural, right? He sees where this is ultimately heading. Yes, he's king of Israel, but God is giving him dominion over Gentiles as well. And we saw this as 2 Samuel progressed, right? He starts conquering people left and right, and there's even times where he's not even trying to conquer people, yet he ends up conquering people. And ultimately, this is foreshadowing what God is ultimately going to do through his ultimate anointed one. And we're going to talk a lot about that in 2 weeks whenever we get to chapter 23, because there is some beautiful stuff that David's going to say in some of his final words. It is going to paint a perfect picture of the Messiah, which is also going to be super helpful for us because we're going to be able to kind of recap like our whole purpose for studying these books. Foreigners cower before me. As soon as they hear me, they obey me. Like you can almost just like see David's amazement as he's processing this. Like he was just a shepherd boy who like even his family didn't regard him as anything. And now he's been delivered from all this crazy stuff. And as he ascends to the throne of Israel, you've got to realize like nobody but God gets the glory. Because David never did anything to put himself on the throne. Right? Like literally God is the one who delivered him left and right through all of this. And every time he could have delivered himself, he didn't do it. So now David's here, he's like, wow, foreigners are cowering before me. Like, I don't even know who these people are. I've never even heard of these nations. Yet they're just coming before me and they're offering me gifts. And they're asking me to like not destroy them. Who am I that you've done this for me? Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. Right? Here he's preserved in the fortress of Yahweh. And these other people who should be hiding in their fortresses, they're left trembling, like they're coming trembling out of them. Why would a king come trembling out of his fortress? What would be the reasons for that?
He knows he's like already defeated by whoever is coming in.
Yeah, so what is it a sign of?
Fear.
Fear, but also ultimately surrender, right? He's coming out and he's like, all right, waving the white flag. He's coming out and so like the imagery is like David's like, all these other Gentiles, they have seen how you've preserved me through these things. And they realize they stand no chance. I'm not even having to raise a sword against them. They are simply just coming before me. Like this is crazy. Like his mind is just blown at how God has done this for him. Yahweh lives, and blessed be my rock. You feel it coming to an end because it was all about Yahweh's my rock, Yahweh's my rock, and now it's coming to its head. Yahweh lives, and blessed be my rock, and let God, the rock of my salvation, be lifted high. The God who executes vengeance for me and brings down peoples under me, who also brings me out from my enemies. You even lift me above those who rise up against me. You rescue me from the violent man. And you can see the imagery, you lift me above those who rise against me. He was, at the beginning of the song, sinking at the depths. People were above him. Now, he ends the song at a high place looking down on them. Right? God has literally lifted him up. He has taken him from the bottom of the sea floor to the top of a mountain. And all he can do is watch on as God scatters his enemies. Basically, David just Even if he wanted to take glory for it, he realizes he can't. Because God alone has just done all of this. And he knows, I couldn't do this on my own. Like, there's nothing that I, little shepherd boy David, could have done to make Gentiles come cower before me. So the only conclusion he can arrive at is that you were with me even whenever I was training for war. Right? You must have been with me in every single aspect of this. Because it's not like you just did the big things. You must have done the small things too. You rescue me from the violent man. Probably in reference to Saul, I'd imagine. But it's also more broadly speaking of just all of his enemies. Therefore, here's his conclusion. I will give thanks to you, O Yahweh, among the nations, and I will sing praises to your name. So what is the conclusion that he arrives at there? Verse 50.
Thanks. Good, Graham.
Same thing. Praise
All
God.
right, okay.
Do that.
He's going to praise God, but in front of who?
Everyone.
Everyone. Right? David is not like, he is the king of Israel, but he does not view this as a simply Israel-focused thing. He says, no, as a result of what you've done for me, the entire world is going to know. Right? I am going to make the nations know who you are and what you've done. You might have saved one tiny little shepherd boy to reign over Israel, but you are the God who deserves praise from everywhere. And ultimately, this is foreshadowing what God promised Abraham, right? In you, the nations of the earth will be blessed, right? It was never just about Israel, and David recognizes that. He realizes that he is just, he's significant, right? He is a very significant person in God's overarching plan. At this time period, he is literally the most significant person on the face of the planet. But he realizes that he is just a small part of a much greater story. And he says, yes, you delivered me here, but ultimately you have this end goal. And you want the nations to worship you. And so, if you have lifted me up, I'm going to help that happen. Right? If your end goal is for all the world to worship you, then I'm going to let the world know about what you've done. And you know what's really cool? This is one of those places where we actually get to see the fulfillment of prophecy right now. Because none of us in this room are Israelites. Right? But guess what we just spent the last 2 hours studying? A Jewish song about the God of Israel and how he's worthy to be worshipped. And that's why we're here. Right? And so, we are fulfilling this, right? David is making known to the nations that God is worthy of praise. And that's why we're here right now. 3,000 years after David wrote this, his songs are still guiding us into worship. But he also understands God's end picture to a greater degree, because he says this. He gives salvation, great salvation to his king, and shows chesed to his anointed. I love that he saved that for the very end. Boom, in with a punch. And he shows chesed to his Mashiach, to David and his seed forever. That's interesting. This whole song has been about how God delivered David. But how does the song end?
David and his descendants.
Looking forward. So David seems to realize that he isn't the end goal. He isn't the fulfillment. Instead, he is just the first example of something that is to come. Right? He is one king, and God will show great salvation to his king, as he's demonstrated through David. But he will show it to all the kings who are faithful to Yahweh. And he will show chesed to his Mashiach. David is the first one, but there's more to come. To David and his seed forever. So he says, yeah, to me, but it's not just to me. Everything I've said in this song, I look back and see how you've done it, but I also look at Hannah's song and realize it's not just about me. This is about my family. And ultimately, it's building up to the ultimate Mashiach, the ultimate king who will come, the one whom we will be able to say genuinely was righteous and committed no sin. Right? That's the cool thing about this, right? We can look at this and we're like, okay, David, I get what you're saying, but we have to kind of jump through loops in order to make it perfectly apply to him. Well, when he says righteousness, it must be righteous that comes through faith. But in order for this to be genuinely fulfilled, we've got to wait for ultimately someone from the seed of David to show up who genuinely does all of this. And he will show up about 1,000 years later. And so that's ultimately where we're heading with this. That is 2 Samuel chapter 22, also Psalm 18 if you want to go look at it. Really cool stuff. I know we went overtime, but hopefully it was worth it. And I really just want to honestly spend a lot longer on verse 51. Do y'all have anything y'all want to say about that particular verse? Because I think it's really cool.
Mentions Hesed again.
It does mention Hesed. Yes. And there's also, once again, the parallels between this and Hannah's song. Because that's exactly how her song ends as well, right? King, anointed one. It might even say Hesed in there, doesn't it? I don't recall. Let me check real quick. 1 Samuel chapter 2. No, those who contend with Yahweh will be dismayed. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. Oh, there's also the imagery of thundering in the heavens, right? Yahweh will render justice to the ends of the earth. So not just Israel, into the earth. He will give strength to his king, and he will exalt the horn of his anointed. Right? So David, he sees himself as the first fulfillment of that. But he anticipates that there will be a greater fulfillment that will come from his seed. And once again, that all ties back to the promise God made to Abraham. In your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Which ultimately calls back to Genesis chapter 3, when there will be this seed from the woman who will come to crush the serpent. And so it's all part of the bigger story. Next week, not next week. Next week is the 4th of July. We will not be doing Bible study that week. But the week after that, we will be in 2 Samuel chapter 23, and we will talk about David's final words. And the picture might be deceiving. It's not actually going to be his final deathbed words. Those are going to come in 1 Kings. It's like his final will and testament, basically. It's going to be his final public proclamation, his final message to the people, akin to Moses' book of Deuteronomy, kind of. And so that's what we'll cover next time. Anything y'all want to add? Thoughts, comments, humorous anecdotes?
Stay faithful to Yahweh.
Yeah. Give praise to his holy name. All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for giving us your word. Thank you for giving us your servant David. And ultimately, thank you for giving us the anointed one. As we've gone through this text, God, and as we spent so many weeks after weeks going through this, I pray that we will understand the big picture of what you've been trying to communicate more and more. And specifically, as we went through this psalm, I pray that we will gain a better understanding of the context of the books, but also how active you are in the lives of your people, Lord. And as we depart from here, I pray that we will just fall more and more in love with you and your power and your glory and how amazing you are. We love you, God. We trust you. We give the rest of this night to you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.